Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the JCC of Metro Detroit's 69th Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. My name is Brenda Brook, and I'm chairperson of the Book Fair Steering Committee, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on this Tuesday evening to hear Jennifer Levitz and Melissa Korn, authors of Unacceptable: Privilege, Deceit, and the Making of the College Admissions Scandal. The goal of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair is to bring the best new Jewish books and authors from around the world to Metro Detroit. This year, the rooms we're all sitting in may be different, but that goal remains the same. The book fair runs through tomorrow evening, December 9th, and we still have 5 exceptional events planned. So to see our full schedule and learn about ways to support book fair and watch events you may have missed, and find our online store where you can buy Unacceptable and many other selected books and gifts, visit our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. This year, in order to provide much programming to the community as possible, we've made all of our events free of charge. So if you enjoy this evening's event and other book fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to book fair. It's not too late, and you can do this at our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. We rely on community support to make this annual event possible. So thank you so much in advance for becoming part of our family. We have a very special event for you this evening, and we want you to be a part of it. So you can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comment section, or by texting to the number in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they'll take as many questions as they can. And while you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. And that way you'll never miss any of our upcoming events. I also want to personally extend my deepest gratitude to the entire Book Fair Steering Committee and staff. This has been a very challenging year, as you know, and their dedication, creativity, commitment, and hard work have made this exciting book fair possible. So the focus of tonight's event is Unacceptable: Privilege, Deceit, and the Making of the College Admissions Scandal. We have with us the authors of the book, Jennifer Levitz and Melissa Korn, as well as Kate Linebaugh, who will moderate the discussion. The largest college admissions scam ever prosecuted by the Department of Justice broke in March of 2019, sending shockwaves through American schools and families. In Unacceptable, veteran Wall Street Journal reporters Melissa Korn and Jennifer Levitz trace the tale. This is a true crime drama of greed and privilege run amok, and it's an important interrogation of class divisions, admission systems ripe for corruption, modern parenthood, and the lengths to which the privileged will go to preserve their status. Melissa Korn is a higher education reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Previously, she wrote for Dow Jones Newswire. She's a graduate of Cornell University and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Jennifer Levitz is a national reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Previously, she wrote for the Providence Journal and has been a member of 2 Pulitzer Prize finalist teams. She graduated from Loyola University of Maryland. Kate Linebaugh is the co-host of the Journal and has worked at the Wall Street Journal for 15 years, most recently as the Deputy U.S. News Coverage Chief. She's a graduate of the University of Michigan. Go Blue. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Levitz, Melissa Korn, and Kate Linebaugh.
Hello. Thanks so much. This is the glorious podcast studio where I record the Journal podcast, which is a daily news podcast about money, business, and power. And the college admissions scandal is all of those things. Jennifer and Melissa are 2 of the best reporters that the Journal has. They embody all of the great aspects of the Wall Street Journal: dogged, persistent, as well as incredibly fair and extremely thoughtful and empathetic in their reporting. And you'll see that in their book. They really bring you as a reader into the lives of everybody involved in this like crazy scandal, from the mastermind, Rick Singer, to the coaches he paid off, to the parents who paid him and the prosecutors who charged them all. And they even talk to the kids. So they lay this out in incredible detail. It's like you're in the room with these people. I want to start with a moment that you guys got involved with covering this. And it was an average Tuesday morning back in normal times when we were in the office together. And we heard from one of our legal reporters that something big was going to go down in Boston. And we don't have legal reporters in Boston. So we had to call Jennifer, who was in the middle of working on another story that you got Pulitzer recognition for, right? To ask her if she would go. So Jennifer, can you tell us what it felt like that first day in the college admission scandal at the courthouse? And how could you tell that you were on to an extraordinary story?
Yes, Kate, it was a typical Tuesday. I remember it was very cold in Boston and I had a lot of writing to do. So I came into work. I think I even had a coffee and I was sitting at my computer. I was just ready to go. One of the things I love about journalism, though, is that truly no 2 days are the same. So very quickly, we start to get word that there's a big story breaking at the federal courthouse in Boston. And then soon after, we get press releases, not only from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston, but from the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., and from the FBI in Washington, D.C. So you quickly see a lot of agencies are involved. They all want to let it be known that that they're involved and that it's a big deal and you should be there. So off I go. We didn't know what this was about. I trot down there, and the courthouse in Boston is probably the most beautiful federal courthouse in the whole country. It sits on the harbor. It's got a whole back glass wall. So you go in, it's always kind of interesting to be there. There's always something big happening. They've had the marathon bombing trial there, Whitey Bulger. So little did I know that I was walking into probably, which is an even more high profile case than any of these. So I truck up to the 9th floor, which is the press office, and it's just packed. And quickly you realize that this is something involving a lot of agencies, because you have the U.S. Attorney himself there, the head of the IRS in New England, and the head of the FBI. And they're all arrayed on a stage with a big seal behind them, and there's some prosecutors behind them. And then the U.S. Attorney Andrew Lelling starts right off, and he says, this is the largest education scam ever prosecuted by the Department of Justice. And he starts to lay out just this amazing tale that you could hardly get your hands around. And there were even displays. They even had like picture boards. They had a poster board with this man's face in the middle. No one knew who he was. No one knew the name. It was Rick Singer, and just looked like a basketball coach, which is what he was, and little chart lines out to other people. So, and then of course, Melissa, by now we know it's education. She's actually on the line listening into the press conference. So we're sort of like covering it together.
And I'll jump in. So Jennifer was doing that in New York, and she was lucky to be there in person and see all this unfold. I was going back and forth listening to the press conference while also reading through this FBI affidavit that laid out all the details of the charges against these dozens of parents. And then there were also other court documents detailing the charges against coaches and some of Rick Singer's kind of lieutenants. And it was just, boldface name after boldface name, and start kind of piecing together who's who in this and exactly what they did. And it was one of those stranger than fiction moments, because you just couldn't believe that this was happening.
Right. You've got Lori Loughlin, you've got Felicity Huffman, and Melissa, you cover higher ed. Why was this very tabloid story a Wall Street Journal story? What about it stood out for you?
Yeah, so yes, there were celebrities and kind of Hollywood types, but there were also executives, right? CEOs of publicly traded companies, high profile lawyers, doctors, private equity investors. So those are certainly Wall Street Journal industries. So is Hollywood, for that matter. And I think this story was so much about money, about privilege, about equity, fairness. Our readers tend to be really interested in stories about college admissions, because many went through it themselves, have kids going through it, grandkids going through it. It's relatable. And to know that the system that at least had this veneer of meritocracy just was so rotten that this could happen, I think was just startling to some readers. Some readers kind of said, yeah, of course that's happening. I tend to be on the more cynical side myself. But it was just, it touched on so many of these themes that are so core to what the journal writes about and what we're talking about as a society today.
And it's December. I mean, it is application season. One thing before we kind of dig into your reporting, which I think is really fascinating, but before we get there, can you talk a little bit about how the criminality of this scheme, the pay to play here, can you compare that to the age-old practice of automatic admissions based on heritage, based on legacy, based on giving money for a building or establishing a chair?
Sure. I mean, the items that you've mentioned, those practices are indeed prevalent and often widely criticized. But what Singer did was he very much used those. What he would tell parents is, yes, there are these other things you can do. You can donate money, for a wing or whatever, but that's going to be very expensive for you. That's going to be many, many millions of dollars. And it's not a guarantee. He'd say it's going to give you a leg up, but it's not a guarantee. So he would call donating a lot of money going through the back door. He'd say you can go through the back door, donating a lot of money. You can go to the front door, which is just you being you and presenting your application. Or you can try my way, which is the side door. It was a lot less expensive and it was a guarantee. And the not only that, so, and we can get into exactly what the scam was, but, his prices range from, anywhere from like $15,000 to $250,000 for his illegal things that he had going on. But the other difference was that in those other practices, the school's kind of involved. The school is involved. It's above board, whether you like it or not. In this case, he had allegedly rogue employees in the school whom he had bribed to do this method. And the other part of it was that he had real outright fraud. It wasn't just, I'm going to give you money near application and, wink, wink, nod, nod, put my kid in. This was presenting kids as, in many cases, as athletes for sports they didn't even play. So there was a real wholesale fraud aspect to this, which differentiated it.
So let's talk about this complicated scheme that came out that day. There was dozens of family, a raft of coaches, these SAT and ACT test takers. And at the time, we set up a big whiteboard in the office that ended up just looking like spaghetti, trying to connect all these people together. Melissa, can you talk about how you first approached reporting this complicated web and then were able to keep breaking stories on this all year?
Yeah, so you say spaghetti. I think it looked a lot like one of those conspiracy theorists who's, trying to piece together, and that's kind of what we were doing. So the scheme itself, kind of in a nutshell, there were two prongs to it. The first one was about testing, and Rick Singer would encourage certain clients to have their kids tested for learning differences, which would allow them to get extra time on the SAT or ACT. That if you got an extra time, you could take it at a different location. And he paid off those test site administrators to look the other way when a proctor that he was also paying would go in and fix the wrong answers after a kid had finished the exam, or in some cases just fed them the answers there. They were in on it. The other part of it was this athletic recruiting where he would pitch his clients' kids as star athletes, tennis and
water polo,
yes, and soccer and sailing and these lower profile sports that people just didn't pay as much attention to. So they would put up together this kind of fake profile with all these accolades and, race times and MVP and all of that. Sometimes Photoshop the face onto a picture of somebody else who actually played the sport. And the family would give money to Singer and also often directly to the school which made it look a little bit more legitimate, right? You're making a donation to the school, to the athletic department. Singer would also pay coach of that team, or in some cases, allegedly some other folks at the institutions, at the universities, to flag these kids as recruits. And being a recruited athlete, if you have the bare minimum academics, that's about as close as you can get to a guarantee. So that was, in a nutshell, again, even the nutshell is pretty long and complicated.
Right.
So yeah, it was fascinating. We knew very quickly that there would be a lot of threads to be keeping track of. So that's where our spaghetti whiteboard came in. We quickly started putting together a spreadsheet of all the defendants, all of their lawyers, all of their crisis communications people, because many of them hired entire teams to kind of shield them from us, or the people like us. And Jennifer and I kind of divvied it up and said, okay, you take this family, I'll take this family, and we'll start to get to know the people in their orbits. And from the very beginning, we were able to break news about how the whole scheme came up, how the whole investigation came about, who the tipster was that tipped the feds off to this whole thing. And from there, the scoops kept building. We were able to, my favorite one is how we identified this girl who had been admitted to Yale. Her family paid $1.2 million to Rick Singer to get there.
Wow.
And we didn't know her family wasn't charged. Her parents weren't charged. We didn't know her name. She was just Yale applicant 1. And we figured out that the freshman Facebook for Yale is pretty static. So we could look through the freshman Facebook. We had some details from court documents about this was somebody who allegedly played soccer in Southern California, who perhaps had some connections to East Asia. Went through the freshman Facebook and started seeing, okay, are they still there in the directory online? And checked every few days for weeks. And then one Sunday night, right before Game of Thrones, I was, doing my regular check, and the name had disappeared. And then we realized, we know who this is. We have this person now.
You're like a detective.
Yes. From the
Hey, we have a question here.
Yes.
Did you two know each other before or work together before you worked on this book together?
We did. We knew each other, but I was in the Boston office and Melissa was in New York. So we hadn't really spent much time at all together. And I don't think we'd worked on a story. We hadn't intersected on a story before. But of course, I knew Melissa. I knew she had a great reputation. Like, we just had a collegial relationship. But we went from that to spending I spent, more time with her than anyone else, and then all night on the phone and Google Docs and weekends. So it turned out to be a very good thing that we got along great. We had a lot in common, because it would have been, I could imagine.
They're both incredibly hard workers, dedicated to precision in a way that is just amazing. And also, what day did the indictment come down?
March 12th, 2019.
March 12th. And when did you submit your book proposal?
A couple weeks later. We heard from
the wedding. You guys teamed up before you even really knew one another, but you knew that you could pull together a book proposal in over a weekend.
Yeah, and so we had heard from literary agents the day it broke, which is, again, this is not the way it normally works, and we're very grateful for all of the stars aligning in this. But they were the ones who realized this is going to be a book. Do you want to be the ones to write it? And I called up Jennifer and said, hey, we don't really know each other that well. We've had 2 joint bylines now. Do you want to write a book together? And it was kind of, neither of us had written a book before, but sure, why not? So we jumped into it, and it was a lot of late nights, a lot of early mornings. Jennifer was more the morning person. I was more the night person. But we were often the first and last person that the other would talk to each day for months.
And you continued your day jobs while you were writing this book.
We did, because, a lot of times you get a book contract and then you take book leave and all that. but the case was still unfolding and we didn't know how the book was going to end. There were a couple times where we thought the whole case was just going to blow up. And we're like, oh, well, it's just what happens. And life is stranger than fiction. In this case, it truly was. I think we went from celebrating that we got the book contract to going, oh my gosh, because the big thing is with reporting is that, the Wall Street Journal, we're always trained, like, you don't just take court documents or, some filing, as juicy as this was, 200 pages, and set out who someone is. So you want to figure out, who are they really and why did they do it? And we were thinking, how are we ever going to, get to these people and try to figure out like why they did it? Because, we could just rely on court documents, but that's not how we were trained. That's not what we do. We also have a policy of you have to go to every single person that's going to be in a story. And you have to say, I'm writing about you. Here's what I'm going to say. And what do you say about this? And so you have people, as Melissa said, they had crisis communications people behind them. They lived in houses with big gates. There's no walking down the street and talking to the neighbors because there were just nobody out walking.
Because they're that rich.
The level of wealth is, it was stunning. It was to go to we did figure out where everybody lived because eventually what we had to do is travel. We had to get on planes and we had to go, one of us to Northern California, one of us to Southern California, and we had to get in our rental cars and drive around and try to figure out how to get to people because we call the lawyers and of course they'd say, well, my client's not going to speak with you.
So how did you get them to talk?
So what we did is just absolute persistence. We had gotten everyone's, every contact they had. So, you try to go to the lawyers first. Like, would your client be interested in talking? I'm working for the Wall Street Journal. I'm writing stories. We're also writing a book. We want to know what happened. We want to get their side of the story. We don't want to just say based on court documents, because frankly, the court documents make everyone look terrible. That's the prosecution's job, is to build their case. And we knew that, these are people that had other things going on in their life. They had done other things. So really, you're just honest and you make that pitch like, we know this about you. What else do you want the world to know about you? So the lawyers were not super helpful. I mean, they'd be nice. They want to keep you on their good side. They'd be like, maybe down the road, we'll have them talk to you.
Bring you along.
We did not have time. So we also didn't even know if our messages were getting to the people. So we started to contact people directly in every way we could. And I think that's really how we ended up talking with people. We would text people, and just explain nicely what we were doing. And then somebody would say, like, I'll talk to you. We drove around, we left notes, called friends. We're trying to, could you put in a word for me? Or here's what I'm trying to do. Again, it was just, and we were really sincere in why we wanted to speak to them because we just wanted to know. And then, once we got, I'll let Melissa talk more about this too, but like once we sat down with them, it's really just a matter, of saying like open-ended questions like, what happened? How did you get here? And getting people to talk with you. But I will say that one of the challenging things is when people do agree to talk with you, even if they've pleaded guilty, they still, they want to go on after this and have a life. And so sometimes you have to be really careful not to get spun. People want to create a reason they did it. They want to look as sympathetic as possible, which is understandable. But you can't get spun. And so we had to really memorize the evidence. I mean, hundreds of files of emails that the prosecutors had collected so that when we went in to talk with people, you listen to everybody, but you mark off, okay, here, that doesn't jive with what I've seen in the court files. This doesn't mesh. And then you go back and you're like, let's go back to that thing where you said that, yes, you worked with him, but you thought it was all above board. What about those emails that show you're trying to cover it up from the school? Can we talk about that? I mean, you really had to be kind of tough. So,
yeah, I'll say I think people, yeah.
Cheryl, we'll get to your question about the origins of the scam in one sec, but I want to understand when you sat down with these parents who had like crossed a criminal line. They are paying money to get their kids into college. When you met with them, what was your sense of their reasoning and their contrition?
Yeah, and it varied greatly. So I think some people spoke to us because we wore them down. As Jennifer said, we're persistent. And they knew that we weren't going to stop calling and saying, hey, there's this new development, just a reminder, we still want to talk, or, kind of sharing information both ways. Some it was, we knew enough, we had spoken to enough people around them that we could then go to them and say, like, we know everything anyway. You might as well fill in these like 2 holes we have. And that worked for some people. It wasn't a threat. It was more, we have all this information. We want to make sure it's right. So when we did do these sit downs, Jennifer and I would come up with a game plan, and, we would talk for a long time about the questions, the order of the questions, how to kind of go from that calmly listening with open-ended things to the more pointed ones, and, what will this interview look like start to finish? Some of them spoke because they really did seem to regret their actions. They hoped that this was an opportunity for them to redeem themselves, or at least explain themselves. Some saw it as an opportunity to excuse themselves, which it wasn't. And although we wanted to hear their side of the story, we knew that the truth was kind of somewhere in the middle for many of them. But we still wanted to make them out to be more than just caricatures. So having those sit downs was very helpful. I think some wanted to deflect. They wanted to cast blame on other people. And you saw that even in the courtroom, with some people would plead guilty, but still say it wasn't really my fault, or I didn't really do anything wrong, I was had. And they would try those in the one-on-one meetings that we had with some of them. But there's also an element of, therapist or, priest doing a confession or something, right? Like, there were tears. I can't believe
the parents were crying.
Sorry?
The parents were crying.
Mm-hmm. I think we were both had interviews where parents cried.
Yep.
Which
cried because they got caught, or cried because they were ashamed of their own behavior?
A little bit of both. I would say probably more the shame. It was often when they were talking about what their relationships were like with their families now, right? What this had done to their kid, what this had done to their partner, their spouse, their friends, their profession, losing licenses or jobs. They realized that they had just destroyed various parts of their lives.
What does that say to you? What did that tell you about college admissions now?
So I spend so much time writing about college admissions, and every spring I often write a story about how selective the Ivies were this year, right? This school rejected 93% of applicants. This school rejected 94% of applicants. And the schools put out press releases boasting of just how selective they were. I think the fact that so many parents, so many high-powered, successful parents who themselves had gone to college, often very good colleges, felt the need to cross this line, it really says so much about just how competitive it is. And we in the book refer to it as blood sport. I had multiple people call it, the selective admissions blood sport. And it really was just so competitive and so fierce, and the sense of this very high stakes game that you couldn't afford to lose, right? Because these people were at the top of their game, their kids were at the top, they couldn't stumble. And I think it also showed us a lot about this very warped worldview that some of these families had, that they thought their kids wouldn't be okay if they had gone to some other school. And that's one of the astonishing things, is so many of these kids would have been just fine wherever they went to college, right? Their families had money, they had connections, they could help with internships. Many of them were quite bright and did fine, if not great, in school, in high school. So they could have gotten in somewhere. But it was just this sense that, the list of acceptable destinations was so short, and they couldn't see past that. And there's a lot of people and a lot of institutions to blame for that happening, but that is the point where we are in super selective college admissions right now in these places like Brentwood and Greenwich and La Jolla.
Okay, so Cheryl is asking, did Rick Singer create this scam wholesale from scratch, or did it evolve from his experiences where he then realized the potential?
I think it's actually a mix of both. I think he did create it out of his own experience. So Rick Singer, to back up, was a basketball coach at Sacramento State. He really knew the coaching world. He was a big networker and just a guy that soaked up everything. So he learned a lot while coached junior college. And one of the things he learned that was just so crucial was that, and I was so surprised too, the extent to which college coaches are asked to fundraise for their programs at school. And they often don't like it. They'd rather be coaching and they don't know about fundraising. And so that was a big weakness. He also knew that there was a lot of coaches who didn't make that much money compared to the big money sports at school like football. And they were kind of resentful of that. And he also knew just how much of an advantage you had if you were an athlete, even just a walk-on athlete, not, full scholarship or something. That was almost, as Melissa said, almost as close as you could get to a guarantee. So through his own experience, he learned the system and he learned the weaknesses in the system. Then he jumps out and he becomes a legitimate college counselor. And he was throughout, he had that legitimate arm. And he was apparently, by all accounts, very good at it. He knew a lot about which schools. He knew a lot of legal tricks, where you should go to this college because they're hungry for kids from California and Missouri or whatever. And but at some point he starts to just cross the line in all kinds of at first kind of smaller ways, and then they just start to get darker and darker. We know by the late 90s at least he's advising people to you could get a different for the SAT. You could get special accommodations if your kid was learning disabled, or then he gets into maybe you should even mark your child down as Latino when they're not. So it just kept on going. But I think the key to his success, no doubt, was his own experience in college coaching, where there is just some real weaknesses that he was able to exploit.
But the details in the book are just so remarkable and so frightening. And so often he's, just like, I'm going to offer you a service, like you have a service for everything in your life. Yeah. And you chronicled this in there with all of your interviews with all the parents, and like many of them could see that it was wrong, right? Like Gordon Kaplan said, I don't want to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Well, he was. So it's like, Rick Singer was selling something that people wanted.
Right. And there's a lot of discussion about, who was manipulating whom, who was taking advantage of whom. And I think it really was, he had a service. There were people willing to buy that service. And yes, he was very good at reading people. He, was charismatic, and, people warmed to him quite quickly. They liked that he was a little rough around the edges, a little blunt. He worked well with the kids. He could tell kids things that their parents couldn't necessarily tell them, and they would listen. But at the same time, these parents were choosing to do this. And some parents reached out to and were connected with Rick Singer specifically for these services. Others started with legitimate tutoring or college counseling. Let's narrow down your list of target schools. Let's look at that essay again, and kind of more slowly walked over the line. And some of them did, either at the time or afterwards say, like, this isn't quite right. And one example of that is Felicity Huffman, who worked with Singer on the testing scheme for her older daughter, but said no for the younger daughter, decided not to do it for the younger daughter. She was going to have the younger daughter take the test herself. and then maybe C, but then she got arrested.
I mean, I think it feels like a 6-figure payment for guaranteed entry into college. We can all recognize that that is not how the system works, and that there should be red flags just going off, that this is problematic and probably criminal, but they just thought they could get away with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The rules don't apply to people in this stratosphere of wealth, or the same rules don't apply, right? For many of them, no one ever said no to them, right? These are people who have succeeded in everything they've done. They have made sure that their kids have succeeded. They are surrounded by people who make enormous donations to universities, and the kids get in. Money greases things in so many parts of what we do in our daily lives, and this was an extreme version of that, and it was an illegal version of that. But I think there were some parents who could convince themselves that this wasn't really that bad.
That's what's so striking in your reporting in the book. So, and please throw your comments in the chat if you have any, or the text at the top of your screen. Debbie asks, did you get the opportunity to interview any of the kids? And what was their reaction to the aftermath?
Yes, we did. We got the first interview with any of the kids, which I think was the only one until today, when Jada Pinkett Smith interviewed Olivia Jade. But so the student that we talked to was Mateo Sloan, and he was the son of Devin Sloan, a businessman in Los Angeles who pleaded guilty to paying Rick Singer $250,000 to get Mateo into USC as a water polo player. Mateo did not play water polo. So we wanted to know, how did this happen? What did you know? What is your life like? So the interview came about after some contact made with Mateo just on Facebook, because I think this was months later, and by then it was clear, like going through the lawyers to get to Mateo, they weren't going to allow Mateo to speak. And so what happened was there was no answer for a while. And then one day, Mateo just writes back and he says, I want to tell my story. And so he was in Italy, and he was getting on a plane, and he would call as soon as he got back. So I remember thinking, like, there's a good chance on that plane ride he may rethink this, whatever. But he didn't. He got back, and he called or he wrote, and he said, he was kind of nervous now. What do you want to ask me about? And we went back and forth, and I did give him some basic questions, which I wouldn't do for the parents, but I think it's different for a kid. I mean, he's 20, but he's not criminally charged. Like, here's some of the things I'd want to know, basically, not every question. But we got on the phone, and he was a very thoughtful young man. And what he explained was that he was at a very good school, and he worked very hard, and he knew what was expected of him. He always knew that he was going to go to a good college. He was practicing writing essays when he was, in 9th and 10th grade. He had a lot of guidance at his school already, the college process. So he was a little surprised when suddenly Rick Singer's at the house. He's like, I have a college counselor at school. Why do I need this person? And so there's this Rick Singer hanging around. He'd come over on Sunday nights, talk to him. And then he said, and Mateo had like a list of schools that he wanted to go to. And these were not, he had a couple sort of marquee names on there, Georgetown, maybe a couple others, but it was mainly, pretty just good schools, but not incredible schools, or not big name prestige schools. He liked the environment. He liked to surf. He thought maybe UC Santa Cruz, so suddenly Rick Singer's pushing USC, which is just right down the road from his house, and saying, your mom really wants you to go there. She wants you to be close by. His father had gone to USC. So he just went along, and that's one of the schools of many that he applied to. But he never really felt he had a much of a say in any of it. He said in his life, he just felt like his father, by all accounts, is just he's just a force of nature kind of guy. And Mateo, when you talk to him, he just sounds kind of laid back. And he just said he just went along, and he just said that he and all his friends felt a lot of pressure. And he said that he said, the parents at our schools, like, he goes, the pressure. I said, what was the pressure? He goes, the pressure, it's not so much what they say, it's how, like, the delight and their own personal pleasure in your achievements. It's like gross. That's what he called it, gross.
Wow.
And so we talked for a long time, and he said he said he wanted, at one point he goes, I'm glad I'm talking because I finally feel like I have a voice. Like, he was talking, he didn't tell anybody he was talking. He was explaining, he loved his parents. But he was also candid that he felt that they had been overinvested in his life, and that had been, like, they cared too much. I don't even know how to put it. Like, you can feel it when somebody maybe cares too much for the wrong reasons about how you do. And he could feel, that riding on his shoulder, and that was a big pressure. He didn't know that he'd gotten into USC illegally, and because he had not submitted the final application himself. Rick Singer, his team, would submit it, so he didn't know exactly what all it said in there. But he went off to USC and he did well. He was living his life. And then that day he sees that his father's, he's actually home on spring break. The FBI come, there's like 10 people, they take him out. And he said that when his father walked in that night, he's in the kitchen, and he just looked at his father and said, why didn't you believe in me? And, at first he was very, he was so confused because they had always told him they were really proud of him. And he said, was any of that true? And he also felt like, why did I work so hard? Why did I stay up till, take all these AP classes? And why did I stay up till 2 in the morning if they were just going to cheat anyway? So he was really confused. But he said he then kind of forgave his dad because, his dad felt really bad. His dad was apologized and told him, this wasn't about you, this was about me. And I think seeing the whole country come and make his, come against his dad, I mean, he made him protective. He's one of several kids. He's the oldest. He's very protective of his family. But, he felt also just very embarrassed because, of course, many people think like, this is just a dumb kid. And his parents had to do this to get him into USC. So he wanted the world to know that, he wasn't just a dumb kid. I think ultimately it was good for him to speak. He did talk about his parents a little. So because of our policy at the Wall Street Journal, we were writing this story for the Wall Street Journal. You have to contact everyone who someone says something about. So I had to then call Devin Sloan's lawyer to comment on something his son had said about him. And he's in prison at the time. So I said, hey, I talked to Mateo, and there was just silence. You did what? But then I kind of ultimately, like, from what I heard, they all thought the story, they went from being terrified to thinking that he did a good job representing himself. So the lesson was like, wow, Mateo can handle himself. Mateo can make it on his own. He can do something and make good decisions.
And that's something that I think we heard a lot, that these kids were begging to have more of a say in their own lives. And there's plenty about snowplow parents and helicopter parents and whatever you want to call it parents, and this kind of over-parenting. And these kids wanted to just figure it out on their own and go down whatever path they ended up down. And there were a lot of those confrontations like Mateo had with his dad afterwards of, why didn't you believe in me? How could you do this to me? Did you really mean it when you said you were proud of me all those times?
What about Jane Buckingham's son? Didn't in the book, while you may not have spoken to him, you feel really close to that interaction. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Jane Buckingham was, that was a case where Jack Buckingham was, he was a very good student. He had already taken the ACT and gotten in the 90s percentile. But his grades weren't as strong, in his mother's view. He had like B's at a very good school. She'd gone through divorce and there'd been some turmoil. There was just a worry Jack wasn't going to be as good as he could be. So they did the testing scam with Singer, where they paid someone to take Jack's test for him at one of the testing sites that corrupt testing sites that Singer ran. And Jack was another case where he got admitted to college. He hadn't gone yet to Southern Methodist University. And he was home when his mom was taken off, and he just could not imagine what was going on. And he called his father, who lives like 10 minutes away. Dad, can you come over? It's like 6 a.m. The dad comes over and he's like, what are you talking about? He's like, they took mom off. It's like something about like honest services fraud. We have no idea. Maybe she's a witness in something. And there's this scene, we go into it in the book, where he's just sitting there. He's on his phone and they post the indictment and the 200-page thing, and he says, oh, okay, here, more information. It says that mom is on page 15, and okay, scrolling, his sister's there, his dad's there, and then his face just drops and everybody looks at him and he's like, it says that mom paid Rick Singer to cheat my way into college. And his dad just hugged him, and it was just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was just downstairs with my 10-year-old and he was like not letting me help him make mac and cheese. And I had to like pull back every impulse to whisk, just like let him do it. He can do it. It's like, it's definitely hard, but I mean, I'm just talking about, Tuesday night dinner here.
I think there's something to that, right? That there is, and that was hard for me when we were reporting this book, that there was something relatable in some of these parents. I didn't see myself in all of them, and I didn't see myself in all of their characteristics, but there were bits and pieces of some of them that I could connect with, that I saw myself, and I saw, I want the best for my kid. I want to protect her from things and all that. I would not go this far, but you can see kind of, especially when we talk about the parents' relationships with their kids when their kids were young, kind of how they went down this path to end up with Singer. And for some of them, it was good intentions that were then, corrupted and went way off track. But there was still that nugget of good intention that parents can relate to.
Yeah, I think it was in the Felicity Huffman story where she really kept hiring a person to help with this and hiring a person to help with that. So it felt like kind of a natural progression.
Yeah, she was a very insecure parent, and she spoke a lot about that. Contemporaneously, she had this mom blog and would write about how she, questioned her decisions to do a summer vacation. Is it enriching enough and fun enough? And how do I plan the weekend so that my kids are doing everything they're supposed to do? And just having all these doubts about being a mom. So her go-to was to hire somebody to help, look to the expert, find the expert. And Rick Singer had been recommended by a few friends. So he was the expert on this one. And it's really interesting. We have a scene in the book where she's taking notes on her laptop while he's explaining all the different details of this testing scheme, and kind of, here's, pay this amount, you get this, pay this amount, you get guaranteed whatever SAT score. And she's, just eating it all up because he's the expert. He's got to know. And again, there's something a little bit relatable, but also shocking and horrifying at the same time.
Yeah. I would just add, I found myself, we both, you do get personal reaction, and we wanted the readers to have them. I had to kind of talk to myself sometimes, because I found myself just infuriated because I had a single mom and I had such a different life than this. And I didn't understand. I just was like, you had no idea how easy you have it. For instance, in all their discussions with Rick Singer about kinds of school, you'd see long emails. They want a rah-rah school. They want a business school. They want to go back east, whatever. I mean, never did you see one mention of money. Like, these people had no issues with money, which most families today, it's one thing, like, where are you going to go to college? Well, we're looking at different financial aid or whatever. So they, right out of the gate, you're talking about people who could buy any tuition full freight. And you just would find yourself reading it when you see their angst, you're like, what angst? Like, part of you is just like, give me a break. But then you do have to back up, because you have to like put yourself into it. Okay, we all have things like, we all don't always appreciate. I mean, everybody has that anxiety. Like, when you really back up, you shouldn't,
Right. In the sentencing, was it in the sentencing where the judge talked about the cost of their actions?
Yeah, so the judge, there are a few judges who have sentenced parents and some of the others who have pleaded guilty. And we should say that there are some parents and others who have pleaded not guilty and are scheduled to go to trial sometime next year. So this case isn't done yet. But for those who pleaded guilty, one of the judges said, she was kind of sick of hearing all these parents say, oh, I did it for my son, I did this for my daughter. And the judge said, wait a second, did you really? Who were you really doing this for? And her thought was they were doing it for themselves, for their own ego. And the kind of thing she went through was, who are the victims here? And in some ways, these kids who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of it were this was done not for them, but to them. But the real victims were the teens who weren't getting into these colleges because someone else was on a lie. And these are the kids who, worked so hard and probably did need financial aid and played sports. And in the book, we go into detail on a couple of the teens whose photos were used to get someone else in as a fake athlete, and just how different their high school lives were, how different the kind of college admissions process was for them, and kind of how much they were missing out on. There's one part where a high school principal is saying, they don't even know that these other people are playing this game with college counselors and test prep and tutors. Like, that's not even on their radar. And those are ultimately the victims of all of this. The judges were angry. You could see that come through time and time again, that they were angry that these people who had such advantage were already, as one put it, already on third base, but felt the need to cheat to score a home run. Like, they had everything they needed and they still wanted more. And that anger was something that I think the public certainly felt as this case came out, and the judges really articulated it quite well. And we have, a lot of that in the courtroom scenes.
Okay, so Jamie has a question here. What do you think it says about admissions that so many of the kids whose parents cheated them in did just fine at the schools they ended up at?
Yeah, that is, there are a lot of schools where kind of the saying goes, the hardest part is getting in. And for many schools, that could be a fair assumption, a fair characterization. Right, these schools are so selective. Many of the ones that were involved in this have admit rates below 10%. All of the schools, I believe, were below 20% acceptance rates. So these are highly selective schools. And then you go there and you choose your courses. You can take a bunch of easier classes, perhaps. You can challenge yourself. Many of them did fine, and that actually reflected that they did fine in high school too. It does say that this whole obsession over where you get in shouldn't exist quite to the extent that it does. There's a lot of talk about, and there's been studies done on, kind of success after college, and it's not about where you go, it's how you go. So it's what you do when you're at college that actually matters and makes a difference in your adult life. It's, did you have mentors? Did you do a research project? Were you involved in the Greek life and clubs and extracurriculars and all that? Or were you just totally disengaged? And that's one of those kind of lessons that a lot of these parents could have used a lot earlier on, and hopefully other parents as a takeaway kind of recognize that bumper sticker, the name on the bumper sticker, isn't that important. It's what happens once the kid's there.
Okay, so we are winding down. I want to remind everybody to buy this book at the Detroit JCC book site, which is at the top of the comments. And then also, if you have any comments, throw them in now because we're winding up. But so do you think the system is reforming? Like, has this made a change in college admissions?
So I'll give the brief kind of cynical answer, and not really. We saw some signs of reform and kind of reflection right after the scandal. Some schools said, okay, we'll audit applications a little bit more. We'll make sure that somebody who gets in as a recruit actually joins the roster, because they weren't even checking that before. But there's so much trust baked into the system, that's not going away. I think what actually caused more significant change was the pandemic, when we saw so many schools go test optional, right? If some of these parents had only waited a year or two, they wouldn't have needed to try to cheat on the SAT or ACT, because schools aren't requiring them as much anymore. I think it's going to be hard for those schools to put the genie back in the bottle and bring standardized tests back. We'll have to wait and see on that. But one of the most telling moments for me in this whole reporting process was we were at the I went down to Louisville to this conference of college admissions officers and counselors from high schools, and thousands of people. And the refrain there was, this was not an admissions scandal. So this is the Association of Admissions people saying, this wasn't an admissions thing. This was a sports thing. This was a testing thing, but don't blame us. And that was kind of the moment where I realized, okay, this change isn't going to be coming from within.
Where can the change come from?
From a public health crisis, a global public health crisis. I mean, right? Like, these things are being forced on schools, and it's not necessarily by their choice that many of them are making those sorts of changes. That said, a lot of universities are facing major financial strain right now. So the idea of them turning away from a family that's dangling a big donation, that's really hard to imagine.
Right. And big donations allow colleges to accept more kids that have more needs. So there's a bit of a tension there.
Right. And that's something that every school kind of figures out on its own, I think, right? Is it worth it to take this one kid who comes with a big check when it means we can pay, offer scholarships to these 20 other students? And that absolutely is a tension. And I think some would say that there isn't necessarily a right answer there. It depends on the school and their financial needs and their interests. But many admissions officers will ultimately say, we're still not going to take someone who's entirely unqualified just because of that check that comes with them.
I mean, one of the things that is terrific about this book is just how detailed it is, how you get into their minds, their decision making. I think one of the words that our editor, our national news editor, always uses for good coverage is it's very voyeuristic. You get to be in the room and see these people like wrestling both with their misdeeds and then with their parenting, which like is hugely relatable. So it's as somebody who was closely following it as it went down, it was a great read and really makes you just think about life and like the values and of our society in a new way. It's tremendous work. So buy a copy of Unacceptable. Whoops, get it on the screen, Linebaugh. And at the Detroit JCC bookshop, there's the link. And thank you so much, Jennifer and Melissa, for telling us about your incredible work and year of dogged reporting.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, Melissa, and Kate, for being with us and for such a riveting, intriguing conversation. And thank you to all of you at home for joining us. Our next event is tomorrow morning at 9:30 with Robert Cass, author of To Save the Nation. So please join us for our final day of book fair. And remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find book fair events that you might have missed. And you can find a way to buy the book and view any videos that you haven't seen yet. Stay safe and have a great night.